Welcome, everyone, to Nerd of the Rings. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Carl Hostetter of the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship, and more recently, the editor of the newly published J.R.R. Tolkien's The Nature of Middle-earth, which just came out today. Carl, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's dive right into it. So how were you first introduced to Tolkien in the world of Middle-earth?
Well, I can give you the long story or the not so long story.
Whichever you prefer. We don't mind long stories here.
Okay. Well, it's kind of neat, so I'll give you the details. It all started kind of in 1976 when I was in middle school. I had actually, we weren't friends at first. We were kind of antagonistic to each other for some reason that I had no recollection of whatsoever. However, we also both volunteered in the school library, and that's relevant because when I was 11 at the time, over the Christmas break, we were assigned to read a Newbery Award medal winning book. And it just so happens that right on the top of the return stack was a book with that familiar medal on the cover, and it was Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising, which, by the way, I've ever since then been a huge fan of that series. It's a book and a series. And it was the perfect time for me to read it. The protagonist is 11 years old, takes place at Christmas time, and he discovers that he is, although an 11-year-old boy, also essentially an immortal. He can, one of the old ones, they're called, and they're at war with the dark. And so he can do things like stop time and travel through time. And a lot of it is based, it incorporates a lot of British mythology and, of course, the Arthurian legends. I just absolutely loved it. So I don't know how the topic came up with this friend of mine. His name's Tom. But he also was a huge fan of this book and the series. And so we became best friends at that point. So 2 years later, my family had to move to Richmond, Virginia. And Tom, as a going away present, gave me my first set of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Now, I had never heard of Tolkien before that point, nor read anything he'd written. But when I got settled in Richmond, I devoured it several times, loved it. Also, in addition to loving it just as a story and as a work of fantasy, I became very interested in Tolkien's invented languages. You know, I'd see those runes and Tengwar on the title page. And I was like, what does that say? What does that say? And, you know, the bits of Elvish and other languages that you encounter in the text. And I just, you know, I had to figure this out.
Yeah.
So now keep in mind, this was 1978 when I was reading this for the first time. This was long before the internet. There was very little way to find, you know, like-minded individuals. I knew one or two people at school who were interested in Tolkien.
Yeah.
I only knew one other person who was interested in the languages. But I kept at it. I kept reading everything that came out through college. The key moment, though, was when I came across this book called The Tolkien Scrapbook. And in the back of that book, and it's a great book, actually. I think it has actually I think is the best single piece of fan fiction ever written of Tolkien's. But the back of the book had a list of Tolkien societies from around the world. And I'm like, there are Tolkien societies? So I wrote to the Tolkien Society of Britain and became a subscriber to their bulletin Amon Hen, which is still being published.
Yeah.
And through that, I learned about an honest-to-goodness group of people who were studying Tolkien's languages and writing about them in a small bulletin-sized journal called Quetar. Immediately, of course, wrote off and subscribed to that. And then after getting a few issues of it, I discovered that an American counterpart had formed in 1988, I want to say. And it was called Vinyar Tengwar. So I immediately wrote to the then editor and the founder, Jorge Quinones, and subscribed. And I then also offered my services to help with the production of VT. Because by that time I had graduated from college, I had a Macintosh computer, I had a newfangled thing called a laser printer, and I also had the wherewithal to buy a copy of Aldous PageMaker so that I could do the page layout for Vinyar Tengwar.
Yeah.
Before that point, it was a literal cut and paste assembly.
Oh, wow.
Jorge would print out articles on his dot matrix printer and then cut them into columns and paste them on the bulletin size pages so that he could then photocopy them and do the folding and stapling and mail it off.
Wow.
So I eliminated all that manual work.
Wow. Made yourself indispensable right off the bat.
I did. And, so sometime after I started doing that, Jorge just asked me, well, would you like to become the editor, take it over? So I did. And that's how I got to know some key people, including Christopher Gilson, who is a counterpart editor of a larger journal called Parma El Lamberon. Arden Smith, who is recognized as, I think, hands down, the world's leading expert on Tolkien's writing systems. And Patrick Wynn, who, in addition to being a fantastic artist, was also extremely knowledgeable about Tolkien's languages and linguistics in general. And we became great friends, Pat and I, and we actually started collaborating together. Sometime after that, now I had started having a correspondence with Christopher Tolkien, as did Christopher Gilson, because in our respective jobs as editor, we would have to get permission, to publish certain things.
Yeah.
When we first started out, we wrote to the estate and or the publisher and asked for permission. But not too long after I took over as editor, Christopher just sent me a letter with his address and said, just write to me. So I think it was either 1990, I think it was maybe around 1990. Christopher Tolkien approached Christopher Gilson with the idea of editing and publishing the complete Gnomish lexicon in Parma. Now, parts of it had been published in the Book of Lost Tales 1 and 2. But Christopher wanted to see if the whole thing could be published in a proper form. Chris Gilson had invited the rest of us to help him with the task. And so we started working on it, and we would send, Chris Gilson would send Christopher Tolkien samples as we progressed through the work. And he apparently liked it a lot. And therefore, during the 1992 Tolkien Centenary Conference, he asked to meet with us. And during that meeting, I remember it very well. We had a very nice walk in the Oxford Botanical Gardens. And very nice talk, wasn't all business. But he asked if we would like to consider taking on the task of editing and publishing all of his father's linguistic papers.
Wow.
And we've been working on that ever since. So up until this point, that is what I was primarily known as, an editor of Tolkien's linguistic papers, the editor and publisher of Vinyar Tengwar, and an author of articles on the subject in those journals and other journals.
Yeah, you mentioned in your book that you've basically been working on this material for 25 years. Am I correct on that?
This is correct.
Yeah.
So what? Go ahead. I was going to say,
yeah, go ahead.
I can say how that came about if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm very curious. I'm dying to know what it was like working with Christopher Tolkien as well.
Oh, it was just, wonderful. I miss him a lot, frankly. He's a great guy, tremendous correspondent, very keen wit, sometimes bitingly so. So as part of that larger linguistic project, at some point, Christopher sent us a bundle of photocopies that he had collected together, the originals of which he had collected together, in a bundle that he referred to as late philological essays. Now, what that was a collection of Tolkien's later writings in which, while working on some point of the languages, he would take sometimes quite long digressions into other topics that were suggested to him by the linguistic matters that he was working on. When I received the bundle, I sat down, as I always do, and sort of paged through just to see what was in my hands. And I noticed fairly quickly one essay in particular that really intrigued me, and it was called Osanwe Kenta, which in Quenya means inquiry into the communication of thought.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it's an essay on not just Elvish telepathy, but telepathy amongst all minds, including all incarnates. And Tolkien says this is an ability that we all have, although the elves are much better at it. And of course, the Valar and Maiar are, supreme at it. But even men could do this. He then goes into a discussion of when or whether it is lawful or possible to force your mind into another mind. He decided that it was actually not possible, that the person whose mind you wish to enter had to make it open to you. Otherwise, there was no way physically possible to enter somebody else's mind, even by force. But then he goes into the fact that Melkor, knowing this, would use fear to try to cower people into opening their minds to him. So, and then that leads into a discussion of motives, both of Melkor and the Valar. And it ends, I'm not going to give it away, but it ends in a paragraph and a final sentence that I think is one of the most powerful things that Tolkien ever wrote.
That's a good teaser for people to pick up the book, for sure. Yeah. One of the best lines Tolkien ever wrote. You can't get much better than that.
So as soon as I read this, it's like, I've got to publish this right away. And so I did publish it in Vinyar Tengwar, and that was almost 25 years ago. So that essay is included in this book. And so in a sense, I started working on this book. Of course, I had no idea that I was starting a book about 25 years ago.
Wow. So take us through that 25-year period. What was kind of your process? Like, how did this play out? I know you talk a little bit about it in the foreword of how, you had this material that, you felt warranted a book release, and in the last year of Christopher's life, he gave you the go-ahead, gave you his blessing to proceed with this book. So what was that process like for you?
Okay. So there were a few other pieces in that same bundle of papers, the late philological essays, of a similar nature, philosophical, not strictly linguistic, but very interesting, revealing Tolkien's thought on his creations. So I published a few more of those in Vinyar Tengwar over some time. And I was also, so Christopher knew of my interest in this type of material, apart from its linguistic nature. And so sometime after that, a French scholar named Michael Deveau had written to Christopher and asked about his father's writings on Elvish reincarnation, which he refers to in Morgoth's Ring. And Christopher made photocopies of the material, most of it, and sent it to him for editing and publishing in a French journal. Christopher at some point asked me to help Deveau edit this material because I got pretty good at it by that time. I had a pretty good understanding of how to treat this material and present it. So I did do that, and it was published eventually in this French journal, whose name I will not attempt to pronounce because French is really not one of my languages. So there were things like that, and this reincarnation essay, the things I'd published in VT. But then also there were late writings that were published in particularly Parma El Alambro in 17, which is Tolkien's own extensive index and glossary and discussion of the invented language element in the Lord of the Rings. And in the course of some of these entries, he would again go off on some fairly long digressions about various matters, like the nature of spirits. How do they make their presence known? How can they affect the physical world, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so I knew of all of this interesting material that was only published in the specialist journals. That I even before the book project started in earnest, I felt deserved a much wider audience.
Yeah.
So what happened next was, after Christopher had finished doing what he wanted to do with the history of Middle-earth, he was left over with this one rather large bundle of papers that he collected together and titled the Time and Aging File. Now, as the name rightly implies, a lot of this material is concerned with Tolkien working out time periods and the generations of the elves, what their population was at various points in time along the journey and before they started the journey, et cetera, which can sound pretty dry.
Yeah, I will say when I was reading the book, my wife saw over my shoulder and thought that I was like reading a math book for a second there, because there's some. But I thoroughly enjoyed it because it's showing how how the elves multiplied by generations and what their population was. I was absolutely eating it up.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I was really concerned how people would receive that. But in addition to those calculations, though, he has interspersed a lot of really interesting text. I won't give things away, but there are definitely surprises.
Yes.
Like Orome was not the only one at Cueviana. And so you'll see some familiar names there. Now, keep in mind, of course, these are all late ideas. I don't know that he would have settled on them and incorporated it into the Silmarillion had he actually finished it.
Right.
But to me, that doesn't really matter. What's interesting is that he had the thought.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're going to raise the topic of canon.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was one of my upcoming questions. So with Tolkien's writings, yeah, with Tolkien's writings, obviously we have Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which are pretty straightforward. But then after that, you get really into just I couldn't imagine the task that Christopher and folks like yourself have taken on to go through all these notes and try to determine what J.R.R. Tolkien would have settled on. So as a fan, how do we look at these writings, and we can refer to Nature of Middle-earth here. How do we look at these and determine what should be considered canon?
I have no idea. To me, canon is anything that Tolkien actually wrote.
Okay.
Published or not.
Yeah.
Now, I know other people have different definitions of canon. I think ultimately everybody has their own personal definition of canon.
Yeah.
They pick the things they like. They ignore the things they don't like. And that's just fine as a fan.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think that that's fine if you're doing Tolkien scholarship. But if it's just in terms of appreciating Tolkien's works and the world that he built, ultimately you get to decide what is canon for you and what is not. And you can try to persuade others of your point of view too, of course. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But I don't deal with that issue.
That's a great answer.
So getting back to our story.
Yes.
So the bulk of the material in the Time and Aging file is like as I described, and it basically forms the first section the first part of 3 of the Nature of Middle-earth. And I just want to reiterate one more time: if you don't care about the numbers and such, just ignore them. But be sure to read the text that accompanies it.
Yeah.
However, there were other late essays mixed amongst this material that were not concerned with time and aging and generations and things like that. Those elements are largely, I think, if not entirely, in part 2 of the Nature of Middle-earth, and they get very philosophical, and metaphysical. So, for example, Tolkien writes an essay about death, and he asks whether, if in Arda Unmarred, had it ever existed, would things have died? And not to give anything away, but he basically realizes that, well, yes, some things had to die so that other things could live. So let's see, what else? There's a lengthy essay called The Primal Impulse, in which Tolkien basically presents a theistic form of evolution, of the origin of species, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
And by the way, I don't know how many people are very interested in metaphysics, but it also amply demonstrates that Tolkien was very familiar with both Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas.
Yes.
And I point this out in the book. For those who are scared by these things or don't really care about them, just ignore it. But if you want to know more about what Tolkien's talking about, I do provide an appendix on metaphysical and theological themes. So if you see something and I point you to that appendix, if it interests you at all, check it out. You might find it's something you'd like to explore more, or it may just be something that doesn't interest you.
I do really appreciate, and it's the same way I read History of Middle-earth is I kind of go to the table of contents and then I hop around like crazy. As soon as I picked up this book, I immediately started paging through the table of contents, and I saw like, oh, there's a section on Nargothrond. I want to read that right now. Immediately went to it.
Well, every new Tolkien book that comes out, the first thing I do is go to the index and look for my name. I freely admit it. Yes. I actually, in terms of a reading strategy, I would recommend that people, when they first get the book, read my foreword and then read the introductions to the 3 parts. That will give you a really good idea of what the book contains and how it's shaped, and then you can decide what you want to dive deeper into.
Yeah.
There's no reason not to skip around the book.
Yeah, and there's definitely some really I know even in the promotional blurb, there's some minor things like who can grow beards and who can't, which I thought was really interesting. That was one of the first things I looked at out of curiosity.
I take great delight in showing that Peter Jackson, that Radagast actually had a light, short, curly beard. Brown.
He probably didn't have bird poop in his hair either.
I'm pretty certain of that.
That's my thing I've always harped on. But so we've got talking about who.
Well, should I go back to my story of how?
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah. All right. So basically, Christopher, when he sent me this material, he said, "What do you think of this? What do you think? How do you think it should be?" Well, I think the term he used was disposed of, but it doesn't mean thrown away. It means how should it be? What should be done with it? So I looked at it, read through it, thought about it a lot. Started thinking about the other things that I had mentioned that I thought deserved wider audience. And somewhere along the line, it occurred to me that, hey, this could all be put together in a single coherent book, despite the disparity of the topic, but under the umbrella of nature. And that's how I settled on the title, The Nature of Middle-earth. And what that allowed me to do is to play on an ambiguity in English on what nature means. One primary sense, of course, is the natural world, the flora and fauna, geology, geography, etc. And that is in this book. But the other primary sense is something's essential characteristics, its inherent qualities, like human nature. So And then I realized that if you sort of that really nicely bookends the scope of this book.
Yeah.
And I like to say that if you find your interest anywhere along that spectrum, you will find something of interest in this book. So
absolutely. Yeah. I've had the book now for just over 24 hours, and I could say I've been sneaking moments every chance I get, because I almost every time, I've picked out a section to go to. Well, every time I've picked out a section to go to, I find something that I'm like, whoa, I didn't know that. And it's so exciting because it's not every day we have a new Tolkien book and new Tolkien material to talk about.
that's right.
So was there anything in the process of writing, or in the process of going through Tolkien's notes, that's in the book that surprised you, or do you have a favorite discovery?
There are numerous things that I just find either surprising or delightful or charming, and not to give too much away, but I'll leave the viewer with 2 words: dancing bears. And Matt, if you don't know what I'm talking about yet,
I haven't got there yet. What section should I go to?
I think it's in indexes. I think it's in the Lands and Beasts of Numenor. The Land and Beasts of Numenor.
Oh, okay.
But then, so I was surprised at Tolkien's mathematical capabilities.
Yes.
It's one thing to add numbers together, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's quite another to work out this complex scheme, generational scheme. And there's even, as I point out somewhere in the first part, at one point, Tolkien decided to calculate some ratio involving time, units of time.
Mm-hmm.
And he calculated this out. Now, keep in mind, this is before the age of the electronic calculator.
Yes.
Such a thing, to the extent it existed, was both huge and terribly expensive.
Yes.
And
that was eye-opening for me.
Yeah.
When I read that part, I had never even thought about that aspect of it, but It's very impressive.
So he worked this ratio out to about 360 decimal places, and noticed where the pattern started repeating, which takes some remarkable mathematical sophistication. I couldn't do it by hand.
Oh, gosh,
I wouldn't do it by hand. So there's really 2 questions here. How did he do it, and why?
Why?
Because he obviously was never going to publish that,
Yeah.
for his own amusement.
Yeah. Wow.
I think
he's that thorough.
We get another glimpse as to why he never completed the Silmarillion.
Yes. Yeah. He's busy doing complex math problems that would never see the light of day.
Yes.
Oh man. Yeah. And I know, obviously we're kind of tampering how much we give away. We obviously want people to check out the book because there's a ton of information in here. I can attest after just a day with the book. But one thing that really blew my mind was that the concept of the Valian year is quite a bit different than what up until now we've thought that it equaled in terms of like years of the sun. So there's some very big implications in some of the changes in this book.
Yes, indeed, and that is why Tolkien spent so much time working out those implications, as you see, particularly in part 1, both for chronology and for the lifetime span of elves, which was greatly increased. I should say, to start to understand, at some point around 1957, Tolkien decided that the Valian year was not 10 years, or I think it was like 9.5.
Yeah.
As it had been previously, but that it was in fact 144 years, sun years. And so you can see that has, and how, despite that, he basically kept the same year numbers,
right,
for the tale of years. So he essentially increased the time before the elves arrived at the shores of Beleriand by 14
times. Yeah. Wow.
And obviously that has a lot of implications.
Yeah.
In
terms of ages and
Exactly.
And yeah, there's also, you know, speaking of times, you know, we have things like the elves, you know, their lifespan, and you know, the time frame where they you know, where they have kids and when they would get married and stuff like that. So there's just an incredible amount of detail. One of my favorite as a parent was the little tidbit that elf children were very well behaved, it sounds like.
Yes.
I don't know what their secret is, but there's this little tidbit that elf children are very well behaved. It must be the finger game that you mentioned. I don't know if you want to go into any detail on that.
Well, as you'll discover as you read along, it becomes quite plain, and as Tolkien makes it quite evident that, in effect, Tolkien imagined elves to be unfallen men, unfallen people of a human kind.
Right.
Okay. Whereas men fell corporately, according to the Bible, and also according to what Tolkien writes in various places in the history of Middle-earth, and in one of the essays in this book, the elves did not fall corporately. Individual elves could fall.
Yes.
Although he says at one point that none of them ever did. Because basically falling meant that you rejected Eru and took something else as God.
Okay.
Okay. So that explains why elves have much greater control over their thoughts, their feelings, their spirit, and their physical bodies. And I expect that explains why elf children are better behaved.
Better behaved.
There's no demon in them.
Well, there we go. Now we've got the answer to that. So yeah, if you've got really well behaved children, they might have some elvish in them. So we've mentioned a couple times, you know, the kind of the religious influence on Tolkien's work. You bring up a couple times, both in the introduction to part 2, and then again in the appendix, you reference the pretty well-known, I'd say, Tolkien quote that is that Lord of the Rings, and by extension, we assume the Legendarium, is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. And you bring up the point that, you know, this has kind of puzzled a lot of critics over the years. But I thought you laid it out really well, explaining, you know, how it doesn't mean, you know, because we don't see Christian aspects directly in the book, that the key word here is fundamentally.
Exactly. Which I think people have tended to overlook as just, you know, a filler word, an intensifier. I think he meant it literally. And as I tend to show, and as Jonathan McIntosh in a book a few years ago called The Flame Imperishable much more fully demonstrates, if you look at the underlying metaphysics of Middle-earth, it is profoundly Catholic in the sense that it is clearly Thomistic, that is based on the philosophical and metaphysical thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And if you know what to look for, you will see it.
Yeah. Which you do lay out some really interesting ones. You know, I won't give anything away, but in terms of the ages of the world, that was something I didn't know that there was a connection to the Catholic faith in that even. And so, yeah, there's, it's definitely, you know, I like how you laid that out and kind of explain how it's, you know, more the essence of the work itself finds its foundation in his faith.
Exactly. Yeah. I think particularly the work that McIntosh has done, I think it's as important to understanding Tolkien and particularly his metaphysics as Tom Shippey's The Road to Middle-earth is to understanding Tolkien and his philological basis and intent. Now, one thing I want to say is Tolkien was by no means attempting to proselytize, and I am not either.
Right. Yeah.
That's not what that's not the point I'm making in this book.
Oh, absolutely. All. Yeah.
And actually, this might be a good point to sort of emphasize my editorial approach a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when thinking about how to structure this book, I wanted to make Tolkien's text stand front and center as much as possible. And to the extent that I offer commentary, it's all relegated to endnotes, numbered endnotes. If you don't care about that kind of thing, you do not have to go and look at the notes.
Yeah.
If you want to know more, they're there for you. Otherwise, except for the introduction for each piece, where I try to just sort of, I do describe the physical manuscript in large part because other people who have worked with Tolkien's manuscripts will better understand the nature of the text. And if in the future somebody wants to go and try to find some of these texts, that will help them find them. Okay. And I also take care to give a date for each text to as near as I can tell.
Yeah.
So, which, it helps to understand the development of Tolkien's thought, the relation of texts to each other, and how things, developed over time. But aside from that, I don't really offer a lot of commentary up front, except in one or two cases.
Yeah.
I also, in order to minimize the reader having to turn to the back of the text, I also, wherever possible, give Tolkien's own footnotes as footnotes. So it's right there on the same page.
Yeah.
And the appendices, like particularly the one on metaphysical and theological themes, it's there if you want it. You do not have to read it.
Yeah, that's great. So how I'm sure there's, a challenge and a balance there that you have to kind of strike, because, you can't just throw in a bunch of Tolkien's notes without some kind of explanation, here and there to connect things.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So how do you as an editor, and, I'm sure this is something that Christopher, more than anyone experienced, how do you balance, putting in your own, commentary and insight with the notes of Tolkien?
So some places you have to provide some sort of a connecting bridge between two parts of a text or two different versions of a text, or things like that, which I do. I'm certainly didn't rule that out. But where I do, my commentary is in a smaller type and it's inset from the main text. So you can always tell at a glance whether it's Tolkien
what you're reading
or if it's me.
Yeah.
You cannot avoid it entirely. And you shouldn't even try, really.
Right.
You got to make it flow for the reader.
Yeah. So. Absolutely. So naturally, one of the questions that, because I honestly didn't, until this was announced, I didn't expect that there would ever be more Tolkien books. So I was absolutely thrilled when I heard this announcement. So I think the natural question, now that I've got this in my hand, now I wonder, are there any more writings that could make up a future book, or is this kind of the end of the line?
So referring specifically to Tolkien writing about Middle-earth, I have to say I'm not aware of any other amount of material like this. Now there are, of course, different versions of text that were published. And where the versions themselves had not been fully published by Christopher in the History of Middle-earth. But at some point, people may want to go and look at those manuscripts and work out in a more detailed fashion, exactly what all the changes and developments were. Gotcha. So in that sense, there is unpublished text, but I am not aware of any other writings by Tolkien on Middle-earth that have not had at least one version of it published. Now I could be wrong, but I've seen a lot of Tolkien's manuscripts.
Yeah, I bet.
So now that being said, there's other Tolkien writings, particularly his academic writing, that has not been fully published, including different versions of academic works that were published by Tolkien during his lifetime. So there certainly is that type of material that I expect will be published. In fact, I know of at least 2 projects in the work at the moment.
Are you at liberty to tell us any of those are? No? Okay.
Better not. No. I mean, I haven't been told not to, but I just don't want to make anything uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right?
No, that's,
so.
I totally understand. I had to ask at that point because otherwise I'd get all kinds of comments. Why didn't you ask this?
Yeah.
So this is more of a hypothetical,
oh, and of course.
Question. Oh, go ahead.
There's
yeah.
all the linguistic material too. There's lots and lots of that still has not been published. Some of which contains, some interesting gems.
Yeah.
So there's some of that left.
So you're telling me there's a chance, is what you're saying. We might get a linguistic book.
Well, I mean, our publication program has been carried out in VT in Parma. I don't know whether someday somebody might attempt to synthesize all that and turn it into a book.
Okay.
But I won't be doing that, and I don't see any of our team doing that anytime soon because we're still working on publishing the material itself, which is actually what I'm going to turn to next now that I'm done working on this book. So.
Great. So when did you actually finish the book? We said you started this process 25 years ago. So at what point did you send off the final draft and kind of wipe your hands of it?
I think it was sometime in late May, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
There was the delay. That was my fault. Well, I mean, you can see it's a pretty complex work.
Absolutely.
And 2020 was not exactly a fun year for most.
It was not.
So yeah, but the important thing is that it's done. and I really hope that people will enjoy it, find something in it to really enjoy. So.
Absolutely. Well, kudos to you for owning up too, because I mean, I just assumed it was a publishing thing, but you just went out there and took it like a champ just now. So I applaud you.
Truth is truth. These things happen. I don't do this professionally,
So this is kind of a hypothetical question, and one that I've seen people just kind of throw out there, just in your opinion, or I don't know if you'd have any insight on it, but do you think there'll ever come a time where there'll be future narrative books in Middle-earth, whether that's someone, the estate authorizes someone to do a new story altogether, or maybe something like Beren and Luthien or the Fall of Gondolin, turning that into a more a full book, such like we got Children of Húrin, is more of a self-contained narrative in a longer format. Do you think anything like that might ever happen?
Ever is a very long time.
That's true. Yeah.
I'm sure once things go into the public domain, that sort of thing will happen. However, in terms of something like that authorized by the estate, at least as it's currently constituted, I strongly doubt it. This is just my guess.
Yeah.
I don't have any real inside information on this, but I'm quite certain that Christopher Tolkien would never have countenanced such a thing.
Yeah.
And there are, his wife Bailey is a member of the estate, and the solicitor for the estate, Kathleen Blackburn, has been on the estate and knew Christopher's thoughts very, very well, knows them very, very well. So that's just based on my knowledge of those people. I don't see that happening.
Yeah.
Not anytime soon.
Okay.
But things change.
That's true.
I never thought that the estate would license any more material, like they've done for the Amazon show. So
that's true. So I didn't have that in my interview questions I sent over, but I'm curious, as obviously a huge Tolkien fan yourself, what do you think of the upcoming Amazon show that we know almost nothing about?
Well, I know almost nothing about it either, so my attitude is wait and see.
That's good.
I am hoping for the best.
Absolutely.
We'll see.
Yeah. I mean, it's intriguing to me, you know, the fact that it's going to be in the Second Age is really intriguing to me because of how little, you know, really there is written, especially dialogue wise. You know, we don't have these big lengthy conversations, and you know, it's not like a lot of stuff in the Silmarillion where we have dialogue between Hurin and Morgoth and all this. You know, there's a lot of room for interpretation and creativity there, I guess.
That's right, and in a sense, that gives me a little bit of comfort because I don't feel that they will be as at greater risk of mangling things, at least story wise and thematically.
Yeah,
as was. I don't want to get in trouble, but let's just say I'm not a big fan of the Peter Jackson movies.
Okay.
So,
I'm sure, you know, as someone who's been so, you know, intimately involved with Tolkien's writings, you know, it's you probably have a pretty critical eye, I would say, you know, when it comes to adaptations.
Well, certainly. I know. I mean, I know I'm not here to talk about the movies, but to me, the crucial thing was it true to Tolkien's themes and the feel of the story and the book? And I feel it was not. Those movies were not. Now, a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, you know, a movie's different from a book. They can't put everything in."
Yeah,
of course, that's obvious.
Yeah.
My problem was what they put in that didn't belong there, not what they left out. I'll just leave it there.
Okay. I'm very curious to hear, maybe off the record we can talk about. Okay. I'm curious of some examples and stuff, but yeah, we can leave it at that. That's totally fine.
Okay. Well, I can give you one example.
Okay. Yeah. Give me an example. I would love an example.
Okay. So there's one scene where I think, is it Pippin and Gandalf, where they're talking about death?
Yes.
And Gandalf, you know, gives it says in speech, essentially the scene that in the book is where Frodo reaches the Undying Lands.
Yes.
I thought that was a fundamental betrayal of one of the fundamental themes of Tolkien. And this is why.
Yeah. Men
do not know their fate in Middle-earth.
Yeah.
Gandalf is basically telling Pippin, when you die, you're going to go to heaven and everything's going to be great.
Yeah.
Gandalf doesn't know that.
Right.
And, you know, men certainly don't know that. I just thought that cheapened the whole thing. It also gives a false impression that Frodo went to heaven.
Yeah.
But he didn't. He went to Tol Eressëa.
Right.
And then he lived there for a time until he was healed, as healed as he was going to get, and then he too died.
Yeah.
And then went who knows where.
Right. Because nobody knows. Yeah.
Not back then, like you say. It's more properly pre-Christian. I wouldn't say it's unchristian, but it's pre-Christian. So
yeah,
there is no promise.
Yeah, that is interesting. You know, I've thought of that scene before. You know, when I watch it, and you know, thinking that Gandalf saying like, well, this is what I'm going to see when I sail west. Like, but it'd be almost morbidly funny to be like, Pippin, I just don't know what's going to happen to you, man.
Well, in which case I would just say, why put it in there?
Right. Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
So one thing, you know, in the intro to part 3, that I picked up, you know, the specific example you gave was Tolkien properly calculating the travel times of the Fellowship meeting in Rivendell. You know, with some of them traveling on horse. You know, Boromir travels on horse for part of the way, and then he's on foot. and Gimli's coming from Erebor. And as someone who integrates maps a lot into my videos, I really appreciate this example. But it goes to show how concerned Tolkien was with making things as real and in line with our own world as possible and believable.
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously a great concern of his, particularly after finishing The Lord of the Rings. Well, actually, even during working on Lord of the Rings. And, that's when he decided that the sun and the moon must have been coeval with the earth, and were just astronomical objects, because, of course, the elves would have to know this.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure why he thought that they would have to know that. And that it would have been disastrous had he actually carried that out. And so I'm glad he never did. And B, I think he knew that he could not do that, because it just renders one of the most beautiful distinctives of his myth, the two trees, and thus the Silmarils, into just, I don't know, cheap, pointless thoughts.
Yeah.
No, it would have been absolutely disastrous.
Yeah.
But that was his mode of thinking when he returned to the matter of the elder days. He was concerned to be more scientific, more rigorous, and more methodical, coherent, and define all of these details.
That's great insight. So was there any other, that's a great example of this. My next question was going to be, were there any, pieces of text where, having such a deep knowledge of Tolkien already, from childhood, even, where you read Tolkien's notes and you just kind of thought to yourself, are you sure about this, J.R.R.? Are you sure you know what you're doing here?
Well, I'll give you a good example of that. There's a text in there that's called, I got to remember correctly, it's The Númenórean Catastrophe and the End of Physical Aman. And in this text, he basically decides that Aman could not have been removed physically from the Earth without becoming a satellite of Earth. And so he decided that it had to be removed only in a spiritual sense, but that physically the land remained. And there's a quote in there, something about the land of Valinor not being hallowed by, it's not the land that is hallowed, it is the people that hallow the land, or words to that effect, the inhabitants. And he actually states that Aman becomes the Americas. What's left of it. Now, I mean, it's a cool idea. A lot of people have thought, I wonder if that's the case,
well, especially for us as Americans. I mean, we're kind of like, okay, I could get that.
Yeah. The problem with that is, though, that in The Lord of the Rings, we see Frodo, apparently very physically embodied, sailing to Tolerancia, which is a real physical place.
Yeah.
Obviously it can't be true that it's just a spiritual realm.
Yeah.
So
Frodo did not just like pull up to port in Florida or anything like that, I guess.
No. So yeah, I mean, there are areas where, but keep in mind too, in a lot of these texts, Tolkien is thinking on paper with his pen.
Yes.
He does that a lot. So he's just trying out ideas. He's not really necessarily committing to anything. And, sometimes he does realize when he's, written himself into a corner, as it were, or, decided something that can't really be true. There's no evidence that he reached that point with this particular matter, but he would have eventually.
So I'm curious, as an editor, and getting this essentially a box of photocopies from Christopher, and I would imagine Christopher had the same situation where he's dealing with even more notes. What is it logistically, physically like with all of these scattered notes and pieces of paper, like how do you even begin to organize something like that?
Me personally, or
Yeah, yeah.
the Tolkien papers in
Or
general?
or the what Christopher did, or
So Tolkien and Christopher began organizing Tolkien's papers before he died.
mm,
As I understand it, they were sorted out, generally speaking, not always completely thoroughly, and distributed amongst a large number of file boxes, or what Christopher refers to as box files. Um, and so, subsequent to his father's death, of course, he would then have continued. In fact, he continued, I think, until near the end of his life, because he still had papers in his possession. As far as I know, I don't know that everything's gone to the Bodleian yet,
mm,
but I believe that's the intent.
yeah,
That everything that was in Christopher's possession will go to the Bodleian at some point. And so he went through and numbered things and tried to provide some notes and descriptions and things. So when he sends me stuff, if he hasn't already numbered it, he'll supply a number for each page, each side, and I just pretty much retain the organization that he supplied the papers to me in. So I have my own set of box files for the stuff that I've received, and I have not reordered things. Now, that being said, that just because I haven't physically reordered anything doesn't mean that I can't, index them some way and then come up with different orderings if I need to.
right.
Digitally.
Okay.
So
that's why I was curious if at some point, like you mentioned earlier, kind of on the front end of your fandom where we were technology wise with your computer and printer setup and everything. So I was curious if you kind of moved to a digital organization system at all with these writings.
So particularly for the materials that went into this book, I did scan everything so that I would have ready access to it on my computer. There's advantages to doing that too, because you can zoom in, you can play around with the contrast, help you decide what a word says. I haven't mentioned yet, but a major part of the challenge of editing Tolkien's papers, is often his handwriting, interpreting his handwriting. So it's easy to look at the printed page and think, oh, this is not so hard to put together. Well, I had to read all of that in Tolkien's handwriting and then type it, myself.
Yeah.
So a huge amount of work that went into this book is basically invisible. And if an editor does their job right, it should be invisible.
Yeah. So is that reading his handwriting, is that something that Christopher also struggled with?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Tolkien himself struggled with it. I've got several examples where he's written something, and then at a later date has gone back and he's trying to
read his own writing.
He's interpolated little notes where he writes what he thinks the word says or what it might say, and sometimes even he is defeated. So yes, but that being said, Christopher was remarkable at reading his father's handwriting. And not to brag, but I've gotten pretty good at it myself.
I was gonna say, I bet you have
it for quite a long time.
Yeah. Don't undersell yourself here. So I wanted to ask. So I usually ask everyone some general, questions about you as a fan. So, as a fan, who is your favorite Middle-earth character?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I can pick just one favorite. Gandalf's way up there.
Yeah.
I have a real soft spot for Sam. I think in many ways, and Tolkien agreed, he is arguably the real hero of the story.
Right.
Finrod.
Yes.
Gosh, it's so hard to narrow.
I know, right?
Feanor is a fascinating character to me.
Mhm.
I don't know if I would say he's my favorite because
Yes.
he's got some deep, deep flaws.
It's got some issues.
Got some real issues. Whole big balanced set of issues. So yeah, I can't really narrow it down that much.
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty good list. I feel like.
I would say overall, in terms of, I'm extremely fond of elves generally, and the whole concept of elves. That's why I love the Silmarillion so much.
So my next question was going to be, what's your favorite Middle-earth book aside from the one that you edited? Because I would imagine that's pretty far up there. So which is your favorite Middle-earth book?
Okay, so I like to answer that question this way. The Lord of the Rings is unquestionably Tolkien's magnum opus.
Mm-hmm.
However, in terms of the books that move me the most and that have stuck with me the most, it's the Silmarillion. And that, if that gives you some insight into the way I think about Middle-earth and my sort of outlook on life in general, well, you're right. So I like to tell people the first time I finished reading the Silmarillion, I felt that I had lived 10,000 years. And I don't mean like I was, tired or anything.
Right.
I mean, in terms of the scope of what was covered.
Yeah.
It just has an amazing impact. So yeah, that's my desert island book.
Great. Do you have a favorite particular story within the Silmarillion?
Well, I've always been very fond of Eärendil.
Yeah.
Fall of Gondolin, I really like.
Oh yeah,
a lot. But again, it's kind of hard. It's like China amongst your children,
right? Yeah.
It's Jimmy.
It's the one that acts most like one of those well-behaved elven children.
That's right.
The answer. So if you could live somewhere in Middle-earth, where would it be?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, since I would probably like to stay alive, I think
it's usually preferable.
I think Rivendell would be a pretty fantastic place to live.
Yeah.
Either that or the Library of Minas Tirith.
Just the library.
Just the library, yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so then maybe you were starting to think of the answer to this one. So if you could just visit somewhere in Middle-earth, where would it be? Visit, but not actually live there.
Right. Gondolin would be fantastic.
Yeah. Especially if you get to choose, the time.
Yes, exactly.
Pre-fall.
Right. Tolerancia.
Yeah.
Of course, that's forbidden. And certainly Minas Tirith would be great, and Rivendell. Oh, and Lorien, of course.
Yeah.
But again, you got to pick the time.
Yeah, exactly. So what? Or I guess you already said your favorite race in Middle-earth is elves, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is it about the elves that make them your favorite?
I think it's the fact that they combine both beauty and sort of remarkable history with sadness all running through it. Even though they're immortal beings who generally don't die, you would think that they would be just happy as could be. It's not like that at all.
Yeah,
there's that fundamental underlying sadness that just really, I don't know, appeals to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great answer. So you mentioned earlier, I want to circle back to, you mentioned earlier how in the early days of your fandom, you knew maybe one or two people that were interested in Tolkien the way you were. So what's it like, looking back on that now, where we have the internet, we have, social media, and, we're talking here on YouTube. We have all these ways of connecting with other Tolkien fans. I feel, when you were talking earlier, I'm like, man, I'm like, we're so lucky to have all this access to each other, to other fans.
Right. I mean, that's certainly, it's a great bonus, the way that we can all communicate so easily. It's also a bit of a double-edged sword, though, because I like to say the great thing about the internet is that anyone can say anything. And the terrible thing about the internet is that anyone can say anything.
Yes.
So it gives and it takes away.
That's good. Yeah. Now I noticed it seemed to me, and obviously part of this is the groups that I hang out in and everything, but it seemed to me, the sense I was getting online during, you mentioned 2020 was a rough year. It seemed like there was a lot of people taking, comfort and escaping into Middle Earth during, a very stressful time in a lot of people's lives. What do you think it is about Tolkien's work that resonates so deeply with people? And, gosh, these works were, published well over, since The Hobbit. What are we up to? At least, is it getting close to 70 years on The Hobbit?
Oh,
What
that
is
was
it?
37 it came out. So
37. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, gosh, I'm bad at math. See, I can't do
over
the
80
math.
years. Over
We were
80.
just talking about Tolkien being able to do all this complex math, and I can't even calculate years here.
Hey, I'm a computer scientist with NASA, and I can't do simple math a lot of times.
So as someone who's studied Tolkien and worked very closely with his works for so long, what do you feel it is about Middle Earth that resonates so deeply with people in such a unique way that you don't see across a lot of fandoms and a lot of works of fiction?
Right. I mean, at one level, maybe the simplest level is it's a form of escape. I mean, you, for the time you're reading the books, you're not thinking about all the terrible things going on in the world around us. So there's that.
Yeah.
But it's obviously much more than just that. I think Tolkien speaks to the part of all of us that wants to believe, and some of us do believe, that there is ultimately a purpose behind everything. And I think that, Tolkien expresses that and elicits that response, usually in a very subtle way. And not every reader is even going to realize that that's what's going on.
Yeah.
But it definitely is. We all like to think that life has a meaning. And I think Tolkien has almost, if not completely unrivaled gift at conveying that to people in a way that is not explicit and hitting you over the head with it.
Yeah.
The best answer, I think, would be to go read Tolkien's essay on fairy stories and keep the Lord of the Rings in mind while you're reading it. And then I think you'll see some of these elements that I'm talking about, where he talks about recovery, and of course then eucatastrophe.
Yeah.
That sudden turn of joy, which is what he described the destruction of the ring,
Right,
and subsequent rescue of Frodo and Sam as being.
Yeah. That's great.
And that's very powerful. I mean, I don't. It's hard to. I would think most human beings can't help but feel that sense of what he calls eucatastrophe at that point. It's interesting. Tolkien himself wept as he wrote that scene. The accomplishment, or, well, Frodo didn't really accomplish the task.
Right, yeah.
But it got accomplished.
The task got accomplished, yeah.
Yes. And if you look at the manuscript, the first version of the manuscript of that scene, you can see where a tear has blurred the ink.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. I just got goosebumps listening to that.
Yeah.
Wow. So, as you sit here today on the release day of your book, think back to the young boy who was gifted the box set of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So what does it feel like right now as I hold up this book to see a book with J.R.R. Tolkien's name as well as your own?
Well, obviously, I'm very honored to have been asked to do this. It was a humbling experience as well, because I knew I had a great responsibility in my hands. I did not know, and I at this time still don't really know what people are going to make of it.
Yeah.
I hope something good, at least in the main. So it's both exciting and a little bit scary at the moment. I really, you may have noticed that I dedicated this book to Christopher Tolkien.
Yes.
For me, fundamentally, what this is my gift to his memory and my way to give back for all the things that he's given us and that he gave to me. And I will point out that if you will note that the last piece in the book, the main part of the book, is an essay called "The Rivers and Beacon Hills of Gondor."
Yes.
And that was chosen deliberately to be last because it contains some considerable amount of Christopher Tolkien's own editorial commentary that he had prepared for publication in the Peoples of Middle-earth, but it was cut due to length. But when he sent it to me, he also sent me that his editorial commentary and gave me permission to include it in my own edition. And so I wanted Christopher to have, in essence, the last editorial word in the book.
Man, that's beautiful.
So.
Man. Yeah, we definitely, I think, I'm sure you more than any of us, felt that loss when Christopher, excuse me, passed away last year. And yeah, I think that's a beautiful sentiment to give him the last words in your book.
It was the day we all knew must come, but hope never would.
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely all indebted to him. It's amazing to think the amount of his father's work that without Christopher we would never know anything about. I mean, think of all the stories contained, since the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales and all of history of Middle-earth. It's incredible.
It's an amazing and unprecedented accomplishment what Christopher did.
So, sorry, go ahead.
I have to say I can't think of anything comparable.
So you mentioned your hope for the book. We're sitting here not quite a week out from the book's release. You're sitting here with bated breath, waiting to see what people will think of it. What is your hope for what people get out of Nature of Middle-earth?
I guess the number one hope I have is that most everybody will find something that they enjoy or surprised by or just glad to see. I think at another level, I hope that it will show people still more how Tolkien was thinking about his own creation after finishing The Lord of the Rings, where he became very analytical and philosophical about it. I think it's an interesting glimpse into his later life. And it just, I think it should, in that regard, help deepen people's understanding of Tolkien as a person and as a writer. And yeah.
Well, I can attest for myself, having had, like I said, about 24 hours with the book so far, I've already had at least a dozen of those moments that you speak of where I look at it and say, oh, that's really cool, or that's really surprising. So again, folks, the book, The Nature of Middle-earth. Go get it online or go to your bookstore. Check it out, buy a copy, dive in, and you'll definitely learn some new tidbits about Middle-earth, as well as get a, like Carl said, an even greater appreciation for the genius of Tolkien and his thought process in crafting this world. Carl, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today about the book.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. Well, folks, again, it's not every day that we get to say there is a new Tolkien book. So take advantage of this moment, soak it in, dive into the book. And thank you so much for watching. And we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.